listening to the Redfield Arts audio podcast. Dennis Paoli is a playwright and a screenwriter who has had a long, fruitful collaboration with the late director, Stuart Gordon. Hi, this is Mark Redfield. Welcome, and thank you for listening. In 2009, I got a phone call from Stuart. They had just premiered a play called Nevermore, An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe. And when I say they, I mean Stuart Gordon and writer Dennis Paoli and actor Jeffrey Combs. They premiered it at the Steve Allen Theater in Los Angeles, and it was their desire to perform the play in Baltimore at a theater, at a space called Westminster Hall, in the year 2009, which was the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of Edgar Allan Poe. I was doing some work for the Poe House and Museum of Baltimore, and spent a couple of months on the phone working out the details so that they could bring Nevermore to Baltimore, where Poe is laid to rest. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, and I had even found another theater. The space, Westminster Hall, is primarily used pre-COVID for weddings and events, and that's where the city was producing a number of Poe-related events, either to raise money for the Poe House or, of course, to honor Poe. And so Stuart and I decided that maybe it was a good idea to wait, and we only had several months to wait, and we did present it in Baltimore in January of 2010. And that's when I first met Dennis Paoli. But let me back up just a moment. Way back in 1985, I took a break from a project I was working on and just went to a movie cold without knowing anything about it that was called Re-Animator. And I fell in love with it. I was gobsmacked and became a fan for life. So that was my first exposure to Dennis's work as a screenwriter. So anyway, back to Nevermore and the conversation you're about to hear between me and Dennis Paoli. I stayed on the periphery of the production Nevermore, An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe, all the many years that it had toured and played around the country, and was lucky enough that on a handful of occasions was directly involved after the Baltimore production that I produced that was financed by the city of Baltimore. Many years later, in 2015, it was presented by Brian Moore and Izzy Lee in Boston, where Poe was born. And I was the associate producer. And all along stayed a friend of the production, as they say, talking to Stuart on and off. There was a desire to turn the play into a film, which we'll hear about later in the conversation. And if you've been listening to our podcast and you have been following our productions, I am thrilled and grateful that in 2020 we were able to release an audiobook, a recorded before a live audience in Boston of Nevermore, An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe, which stars a brilliant performance by Jeffrey Combs. So this conversation is long overdue. I've wanted to talk in depth about the process and the creating and the collaboration between Dennis Paoli, Stuart Gordon, and Jeffrey Combs. And this conversation with Dennis took place in March of 2021.
It really sort of starts to percolate with the Masters of Horror, The Black Cat. How did the Black Cat come about? How did you get involved?
Well, actually, it percolates long before that in the mind of Stuart Gordon. Stuart was always a huge Edgar Allan Poe fan from when I met him. And it's one of the things we shared back. I knew Stuart in high school. I met him at Lane Tech High School in Chicago. And one of the first things we did as friends was go to movies. And among the movies that we were partial to were the Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Hammer films, the Dracula films, and the American International Vincent Price, Basil Rathbone, Peter Lorre, Poe adaptations. So we were sort of studying Poe and appreciating Poe and being entertained by Poe from very early on. And it was, and he was always, Poe is accessible at every level. Poe is accessible to young kids. It's scary stuff, but if you read Poe carefully, many of his stories are jokes. They're absurdist and often horrific jokes, often on the storyteller himself. But Poe is actually horrifically funny. So you can be a big fan of Poe from your teens on, which we were. So it was sort of something that had been planted in both of us early on, and something that we shared. And when Stuart went into theater, was the director and artistic director of the Organic Theater in Chicago, he was one of the best theatrical storytellers, probably in the country. The Organic Theater was a very narrative theater. They were great storytellers. And among the stories they told were a couple of Poe plays, including one that was written about Poe's, a fantastic drama about Poe's last days, in which he fantasized scenes from his stories. So Stuart was keeping that connection to Poe through the years, and so was I. I went on to become an academic, studying at Columbia and then teaching for decades at Hunter College of the City University of New York. And among the courses I taught for, again, about 20 years was Gothic fiction. And in a Gothic fiction course, you must teach Poe. So I had a Poe story or two that were in the syllabus every year. So we both kept our connection with Poe over the years. And then when Stuart became a master of horror, not from his success with the films that he had made, when he was asked to provide episodes for Mick Garris's Masters of Horror series, we were known for Stuart and I were known for our Lovecraft adaptations, and we did one of those. We did for the first season. We did Dreams from the Witch House, which Stuart had been wanting to do for a long time. And then the second year he was asked to, then the series was re-upped. It was very successful. It was re-upped. And Stuart was asked to provide, do another episode, to direct another episode. And he suggested we do The Black Cat. He had had it in his head for a long time to do an adaptation of The Black Cat, but with the twist that The Black Cat is told as if it were Poe's story, as if Poe were the narrator figure. Because frankly, it's one of the stories that Poe wrote that actually comes to some degree out of his life. Poe, for as peripatetic as he was, meaning Poe lived in so many different places. He was so poor and so often looking for work that he moved from city to city and apartment and house to house multiple times every year, almost every year of his adult life. And even under those circumstances, he always had pets. And he usually always had a cat. Pluto appears in a number of his letters. His cat Pluto appears in a number of his letters, and was a great favorite of his wife, his wife Virginia, whom he loved dearly. So Poe always had a cat in the house. So the Black Cat was actually, to some degree, one of the most personal stories Poe had written. And Stuart wanted to look at that from Poe's perspective. So he wanted to have Poe as the main character who was seemingly living through the story when actually what he was doing was living through the creative process of creating the story, which was a very ambitious and difficult kind of narrative to pull off, and darn it if Stuart didn't do it. The Black Cat was...
Because you've got about an hour to tell that story.
Yeah, you have an hour. You actually have a little less than an hour because it's television, and it's also you have a limited budget, and while the Black Cat does not have a lot of characters, it has a number of different settings. You're working with an animal, and it also is a costume drama. It's placed in another era. We were a little afraid it was going to be costly and we'd have to cut corners. But Stuart was always, it was always important to Stuart to tell the story as well as you possibly can, no matter your budget, no matter your time frame. So we simply told the story as best we could. And luckily we had the talents of Jeffrey Combs in the lead role, which made it possible to do almost anything. I mean, Jeff is so good in the part. And as it turns out, Jeff, who had been in a couple of our Lovecraft adaptations, was a huge Poe fan himself, and was not only anxious but insistent to play Poe, including the prosthetic makeup that it would take to have him. He actually looks a little like Poe. Don't tell him I said this, but he looks a little like Poe. Actually, Poe is handsome. Poe is a ladies' man. So it was in his day. So to say that Jeff, to some degree, looks like Poe to begin with, if you put a little facial hair on him to give him that mustache, he is to some degree a compliment. But it did take a little prosthesis to make him look even more like Poe, which came across spectacularly in the filming. So that's sort of how it came about.
And we'll get back to Jeff and Poe in a little bit, but I mean, I'm curious about process. You had, because you have this long friendship and relationship with Stuart, and so if he gives you a call, says, "Oh, we are going to be doing," you've already done Dreams in the Witch House, which of the Masters of Horror films series. Are some of the few that are taken from classic horror literature, but you're given the green light to do the Black Cat. You get the call from Stuart. Does he share? I'm curious about process. Does he share his outline with you? At what point? What's your process from that point on to do the teleplay?
That's you hit it right on the head. What you just described was pretty close to what actually happened. To start with, when Mick Garris is a really excellent producer in the sense that he trusts you. He trusted Stuart, he trusted Jeffrey, and he trusted I to do good work. So when you got greenlit, you really got greenlit. I mean, go ahead and do it. Here's your budget. Here's the time slot. Go. And Stuart, as I said, pretty much had this idea was fairly fully formed in Stuart's consciousness and Stuart's creative consciousness to begin with. He had been working on this in his imagination for a while, and had a pretty firm idea of how it would play out. It wasn't a complete outline. It wasn't a full treatment. But but Stuart was a master storyteller. As I said, the Organic Theater, his theater in Chicago, was a great. They were great at narrative theater, and some of the best aspects of his film work aren't just he got known for his films being moist, as the term went, for being bloody and gory. He got known for them being outrageous and funny. But if you watch his films carefully, you don't have to watch them carefully. If you watch them at all, you have to be struck by what a good storyteller he is, what a good cinematic storyteller he is. And it was my experience working with Stuart that I could always count on him for a great sense of story, for a great narrative sense. If we came upon a bottleneck in the story, if we came upon a character problem that was difficult and thorny to solve, I would lean on Stuart, and Stuart inevitably would come up with not just a solution, but a brilliant solution that made the story better. It was he really was a master storyteller. And
how long did it? I don't mean to cut you off ever. This is great.
No.
How long did it take you to write the draft that became, or how long did it take you to write the script for The Black Cat, and then they go into production and start shooting?
You're given a few months you're given a few months, but this was most of our projects, most of Stuart and my projects that we worked on together, that we either co-wrote or that I wrote for him, for which he often got story credit, really went fairly efficiently. We worked fairly efficiently, even though we were on different coasts. We rarely worked face-to-face. I mean, we had a long history of working face-to-face. We had been in a satire group together in high school. We had done theater in college, and I had worked with him on a couple of shows for his theater in Chicago for the Organic.
When did you make
when we worked on film, we worked primarily by phone. I mean, these are by phone and by FedEx. These are the days before email, before Final Draft. You would write it up, type it out, and send it send it by Federal Express, and so that's how we worked. And we knew each other's writing abilities and proclivities, and we knew each other's imaginations so well that worked. That whatever we communicated, however feebly, across a telephone line or in a hard copy text, the other person would really understand. The other person would fill in, would read between the lines and fill in the blanks, and augment it from there. So that was pretty much our process. But The Black Cat was written in about a month, a little less.
It's a wonderful collaboration. And I can only imagine, check me if I'm wrong, from this early friendship from high school into college with the improv group toward the organic theater, your senses of humor mesh incredibly.
Well, that's what we discovered about
That's evidenced by some of the films and the humor in the Poe stuff, including Nevermore, which we'll get to in a minute, the play. And am I wrong? Did you jump in as an actor? And when did you want to be a writer? Or is that always part of who you are?
When I was a teenager, I wanted to be everything. I was actually as I said, we went to a technical high school. Stuart was an art student. Stuart was an artist when I met him. And he continued to draw his entire life. He would draw his own storyboards often. And I was a math major. I was a math and science head. Where we crossed paths was in science fiction and in horror films. And I was coming at it from one perspective, and he was coming at it from another perspective, and so we could provide value added for the other person. We could riff on what they said and take it into another area and do that for each other. And the other thing we noticed right away was that we had very close to the same sense of humor. We found the same things funny, which were not always things other people found funny. That was it made a fast friendship. I think our friendship became a fast friendship when we discovered how much fun it was to be with the other person. Stuart loved telling jokes. Stuart was incredibly funny, but he also loved to laugh. He loved if I could write something that made him laugh, it was, one, really satisfying for me, and two, it got done. So as I said, we had a satire group to begin with. We were growing up in Chicago, so our heroes were Second City, the actors.
Second City,
Second City, and sort of the humorists from the South Side who don't get a lot of credit, but if you who came out of the University of Chicago, like Mike Nichols and Elaine May, right? And Lenny Bruce was a big hero of ours. So we loved that edgy humor, that humor that was on the edge, which ended up going into our horror films. That's very you're walking a real line there between horror and humor, and we wanted to do that in such a way that you got the benefit of both. You got the horrific elements and the humorous elements. So that came from our pretty much our original appreciation of each other's senses of humor. And as I said, Poe is an absurdist humorist. Poe is Stuart's favorite Poe story is the very short story, The Imp of the Perverse. And,
which a lot of even Poe fans don't really know. Yeah. Imp of the Perverse.
It's fundamentally at the core of Poe's creativity. And in it starts out, and I taught this in my Gothic fiction class. And it starts out like an essay. You think you're reading an essay. And what it really is a rationalization by a madman of a crime he committed, a murderous crime he committed. But the perversity is that he can't keep it to himself. He's committed the perfect crime, and because it's the perfect crime, he has to give it away. He has to give himself up because it's perfect. The perversity is that perversity within ourselves, which is that self-destructive impulse, which Freud understood, which Freud would discover half a century after Poe. Poe was a brilliant psychologist, besides being a brilliant writer, and his stories delved into the deepest and darkest corners of the human psyche, which troubled him. They were, I think, to some degree, his stories were therapeutic for him because he could externalize his own tortured mentality. But the Imp of the Perverse is a fundamental story in understanding Poe, and it was Stuart's favorite. And it is the idea at the core of a couple of Poe's most famous stories, The Telltale Heart, of course, and The Black Cat.
Check me if I'm wrong. Check me if I'm wrong, but the Imp of the Perverse basically is tripping over oneself, shooting oneself in the foot, doing these things uncontrollably that muck up, screw up all of our dreams and best intentions, and somehow we're our own worst demon. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly it, Mark. It's our demonic self. We have a demonic self within us that always, that we only have it because we are also idealists. You have to be an idealist. Poe was a great idealist. Poe was a poet. Poe believed in the transformative power of poetry. He was an idealist in the extreme, but only an idealist at that level can truly have a demonic self, which will always be undermining that idealism. That understands that idealism, that every ideal comes with a shadow. Every ideal throws a shadow, a dark shadow that can subsume that ideal and destroy it. And Poe, if you look at Poe's life, Poe lived that. That's the central dynamic of Poe's personality.
There's so many known episodes throughout his life where he did that, mishandling his relationship out of flashes of anger with his foster father, his college career, his early work being hired to be an editor, onward and onward and onward. And the High Wire Act, which is wonderful about your adaptation of The Black Cat, because on the one hand, Poe is incredibly prolific. He's writing essays, he's writing magazine articles, he's writing short fiction, he's writing poetry. And for someone so prolific, here comes this shadow. And I think it's a marvelous choice. And the High Wire Act of your Masters of Horror, Black Cat, by using Poe and trying to find that color of the creative act and the tension of that.
Right.
And it's very neat, very neatly done.
And just to tie that up in a bow, it makes a hero of Poe. Poe is heroic in the sense that he was constantly self-sabotaging himself with publishers, with fellow writers, with collaborators. The fact that with women, and it was remarkable that he had as successful a career as he did with that ostensibly oppressing him. oppressing his imagination. And yet it was so brilliant in imagination, and it was so urgent to him that he express his stories, the narratives that he lived, that he ended up being he ended up being one of the most important American authors of the 19th century, if not in all of American literature.
Yes. Let's jump over the film adaptation, Pit and the Pendulum, for this conversation, because to stay on track with talking about Poe the person, Poe the writer and the man, and getting to Nevermore, the play. Because the famous story goes that the Showtime Masters of Horror Black Cat, very successful. Obviously, Jeff's fans love it. He turns in a beautiful performance. It's a wonderful little film.
Yeah.
And the story that I heard from, colored slightly differently, from Stuart and from Jeff, was that while doing it, Stuart, while on the set and while shooting it, the myth goes, the legend goes that Stuart just turned to Jeff one day and said, you are Poe. And that planted seeds for, we should do something with you as Poe. As you mentioned, Jeff is a great fan of Poe's work.
Yeah.
And he's by the way, before I forget, just a complete segue about humor, because Poe's humor is a very important thing to me. When I first saw Re-Animator in 1984, I was acting and directing in a play with a group of 11 other people, a movement theater thing. I was zigging while other people were zagging. And I did a completely nonverbal thing called My Sad Face, based on a short story by Heinrich Böll. It was a live silent film comedy.
Lovely.
And then taking a break, because we rehearsed and built it over about 9 weeks. There's a film that I had heard nothing about, and went to see it cold. And it was called Re-Animator. And it was so refreshing to me. I mean, I'm a horror film fan and a horror literature fan and science fiction fantasy. This film washed over me, and I found it so refreshingly funny and so tight, and so it was just a marvelous thing during when your brain and heart and soul is working on a project and you're so enveloped in it. It's one of the few things that penetrated my little bubble in 1984 building this play. And so I wanted to say thank you for that. But the theme of humor will come back. But anyway, the story goes, and Jeff is an actor after my own heart. He's very much into research, getting it right, not being exposed as a fraud. And that includes you're mentioning his need to look 100% like Poe. Do the prosthetic nose, make sure that the wig gets the hairline right. And of course, you've got a finite schedule. You got to get it in the can, so they're not going to let him grow his hair. But the point of it all is that from these conversations, and as I understand it from Jeffrey, he began to sort of, in the back of his head, wonder, and he first rejected the entire notion, but then somehow it really caught hold of him and Stuart. And the choice, if I can remember what Jeff said to me, was, like all actors, or writers, it's not necessarily that somebody knocks on the door and demands us. We create our own work. You write a novel because you got to do it. You make a one-man show because you want to work. And so that's where Nevermore, An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe, is born, kind of directly out of the Black Cat. And there's, as I understand it, then a long gestation period, a long sort of dipping into it between Stuart and Jeffrey. And if I understand correctly, you get the call, you come in. What they had done together was sort of select you've only, you're talking about a live theatrical performance that's maybe 90 minutes. So they're going to be very selective. They picked a tale or two, and they picked poems that they wanted to include. They started working on those, and yet it needed the package. It needed the structure. It needed all of that. So they had been working, or Stuart had been working with Jeff on Poe's works. When did you get the call from Stuart saying, and I'm paraphrasing, check me here, we need a beautiful frame to put this in. We need a trunk to pack this in tight. Dennis, go. How did that happen?
Again, you're very you're very close to the mark. It's interesting. The writer's perspective is it's what I have, and it's the writer's perspective is to some degree always the least interesting perspective. On
not to me.
The creative process. No, I understand. But it's as you said, when they were on the set of the Black Cat making it, from what I understood, it was very exciting. It was like, oh, this is working. Oh, Jeff, you're so great. Oh, let's do this. Let's make it look this way. Oh, if you watch the Black Cat, it's shot in color, but it looks it's pushed really toward blue, and so it's almost black and white with the hint of color in it. Which gives it a very odd, but again, authentic kind of look. So there was a lot of creativity going on after I sent in the script and was off the project. The writer is always the first person off the project when it's Hollywood. You send in they bother you. Dennis, we need the script. Dennis, can we look at it? Dennis, this is good, but could you change this? Dennis, we need it tomorrow. Can we just send us what pages you have, please? Dennis, you're wonderful. We love your work, but could you, and it's like, okay. And then you send it to them, and then you don't hear another word. If you're lucky, they send you a check. It's you're off the project, and then it's all about, we love the script, let's make it. They don't go around and say, thank you, Dennis, that was really good work. Stuart will, Jeff will, but the producers never do. You're off the project. They don't think about you. Your work, my work here is done. Right. So I have never, though I was one of Stuart's oldest friends, though I've considered Jeff a friend for decades now. I've never been on a set with them. I've never, gotten to work in that part of the creative process. My work's over. I live in New York. I'm on the other end of the other side of the continent. So I didn't participate in that, in what I understood was a very rich creative experience that they shared, which cemented for them the idea that they wanted to do this again. That, Jeff really was Poe, that Jeff channeled Poe. I mean, I could see it when I saw it, when I saw the cut of the episode. It was like, this is spectacular work, Jeff, and this is, this is uncanny. It wasn't an adaptation. It was outright theft. He stole he stole Poe's soul. And it's a torturous story. Poe's best stories are about the torture of the soul. And Jeff went through that, had to go through that to tell the story. So he really bonded with Poe, and he and Stuart bonded on the idea, and I knew nothing about it until they called me. Although Stuart might have mentioned it, we should do something about Poe's life, et cetera, over the intervening years. But when they called me, yes, we have this idea. We have this, we have an idea of a one-man show about Poe. It would be a reading, and they did have the framework. The framework was, this isn't Poe talking to a modern-day audience. This is Edgar Allan Poe in the last year of his life, maybe the last months of his life, doing what he needed to do to keep his family economically, to keep himself, his wife was dead by this time, to keep himself economically afloat, which was to do public readings. And he
lectures,
did
public readings,
he did some famous public readings in New York, and a very famous one in Boston, which for me was the model of this one, in which he showed up totally distracted. It was a very dissatisfying performance. He actually dragged some of the audience back to his hotel room to show them what, some new poetry he had written, because they were so dissatisfied with the performance. And the fact is, he was probably drunk. He was, several reports and reviews of the performance suggest that he was probably intoxicated through the whole thing.
And for the listener who doesn't, a little color for the listener, this late in Poe's life, and the model of the lecture appearance that you're talking about, all of Poe's adult professional life, he was born in Boston. His mother gave him a great blessing to friends in Boston, but with the critics and the literary society of Boston, he was at war his entire professional life. And so there wasn't
the transcendentalists were his enemies, were his aesthetic enemies. They questioned the morality of his work. They questioned the quality of his work. Although they could not question the quality of some of his poetry. But it was grudging. When they did write, and this is at a time when most criticism, and Poe is actually changing literary criticism at this time. He's writing honestly about other people's work, where most literary criticism, in an effort, of course, to sell the magazines in which the poetry appeared, most literary criticism were puff pieces. Oh, this poet is great, you should read his stuff. Oh, look, next week, in next month's edition, we have poems by that particular poet. The critics, therefore, were particularly harsh on Poe. And aside from which, he was not a transcendentalist. His philosophy is much darker than transcendental, than the sort of uplifting spirituality which inhabits transcendentalism. So he was always at war with the Boston, and they were housed in Boston and Massachusetts primarily. So he was always at war with and literally he used the term war with the Boston critics.
It becomes tit for tat. I mean, Poe's criticism grew so sharp. I mean, his nickname was the Tomahawk Man. Which creates an image of frontier and scalping. So and the savagery. They consider Poe to some degree to be a savage. He's although he was probably
among the most educated of the writers of the age. He knew multiple languages. He was great at creating intellectual puzzles. He was among the smartest and most educated of the writers of the age.
And there is that tension of North and South. He portrayed the Southern gentleman, and he was. And
although born in Boston, although born in Boston when he was only a few years old, his mother died in Richmond, Virginia. So he grew up in the South, in what would be the capital of the South. Although most of his working life was spent in Philadelphia and New York. So he worked mostly in what would be considered the Yankee North. However, just to go back to the framework of Nevermore, they came to me with the idea that he would be presenting in his own time frame to an audience, that it would be a specific event in the last months of Poe's life, when he's at his emotional lowest, and he's the most vulnerable, which is perhaps the most dramatic situation you could put him in. He's recently lost his wife, his young wife, who was the love of his life. So he is tortured emotionally, but ironically, his poem, The Raven, has been recognized as perhaps the most important, but certainly the most popular poem written in America to that date.
Right.
So he is he's popular entertainment. If you can say you went to hear Poe read The Raven, you saw Hamilton. You saw the most impressive and important theatrical event of the age.
Exactly.
So he was much in demand.
If you saw Poe in a lecture that centered around The Raven, his contemporary would be on the top shelf Charles Dickens, who was touring and doing readings.
Yes.
And then as time goes on, it's interesting how stars get created, but decades later it's opera stars. Then soon after that it's film stars like Chaplin, and then it's rock stars. It's kind of interesting. Right. So this is why I've always said casually that The Raven made Poe a rock star at the end of his life. Yeah,
it did. He was indeed, as a matter of fact, and as I said, he was to some degree a ladies' man. At the time, he was courting 3 different women, 2 of whom were important American female poets. He was, but on the other hand, his imp was, his demon.
Well, you're pulling
was destroying him at the time, destroying him with drink, and destroying him with his savage nature in relation to his fellow writers. So it was a very interesting time in Poe's life to present him. They also, when Stuart and Jeffrey approached me, because they approached me together, when they approached me, they did have the works that he would read lined up. We ended up leaving out 1 or 2 of the poems because it made a better through line, and it made it sharper dramatically, to not to stop quite as often for a reading by Poe, and but the core of the evening is Poe reading his work, but it's also Poe bearing his soul.
What I think is brilliant about Nevermore and Evening with Edgar Allan Poe, the play, what I've always loved about it is the hat trick. The so deftly, there are hundreds of one-person shows, some very well written, performed, and remembered. One thinks of the entire career of Mark Twain Tonight,
Right.
and some others,
Right.
and there are others that the person just gets up and says, and then I did this, and then this year I did
Right.
that, and it really is a way in that, and I keep rounding it up to 90 minutes, but in that evening with Poe that the three of you have shaped and created, you're able to touch these colors and levels of this person. On the top, on the surface, it's, oh, I love Annabelle Lee, there it is. Oh, the Telltale Heart. Oh, I love it. And woven through that are these colors of this person without getting, oh, I don't have the words, Dennis, pedantic with it, or he comes through living an arc that I think is really wonderful.
Well, he was such an interesting person. He was, he was so smart, and he was so talented, and he could be so entertaining, but he was so dramatic about it, and he was so self-defeating. He was so self-centered on the one hand and emasculating on the other, that that the drama is inherent in his very character.
Yes.
It was as I did the research, and I had been reading Poe and been teaching Poe, and I had been researching Poe I had researched Poe a great deal for The Black Cat. So I had the research there, and I went on and did further research, and I read his biography. I read a number of different biographical pieces on him. I read a lot of the stuff that he wrote for the magazines that nobody reads. But I really read what was torturous and also invaluable were his letters, where he wrote in his own voice, because he was a writer. It was as if his writing voice was his speaking voice. And so I was able to find in that research language that I could use, ideas that I could use, low points and high points in his life that he could reflect upon. Because if you were in your last year, and to some degree, Poe was in such a decline that he must have known somewhere in his being that this might be his last year on Earth. So when he reflects on his life, it's the high points are so precious to him, and the low points are so almost unbearable, because it's as if it's encapsulating his entire life in these moments that he's presenting, and he can't help but have that come out in presenting himself to this audience. Because he's always been a
pulling that
person.
And again, pulling that theme, the imp of the perverse, right into it.
Right, of course, yeah. And he was always a public person. I mean, he was, as you said, he was writing and editing magazines almost his entire adult life. He was pitching works to publishers. There's a scene in which he does that in The Black Cat, and can hardly and imagines violence against this publisher, which he can only barely stop himself from committing. He was always, to some degree, performing in his life, and it comes out in his character. It's at the core of his character, so that when he reads certain poems, such as Alone, such as Annabel Lee, such as A Dream Within a Dream, you know what parts of his life he's referring to. Annabel Lee is about losing Virginia, about losing his young wife, about losing Sissy. And it's a dramatic poem. It's not this ideal poem. It's not this sad poem about some faraway land many, many years ago in a kingdom by the sea. The Kingdom by the Sea was the hovel that Poe lived in when Virginia died. When Virginia died of tuberculosis right in front of him. It was, so it's when he's reciting that poem, he's reliving losing her. So it all the pieces started to fall together so well. The language, the more I read his letters and his biography, the more I heard him. It was like I must be the king of collaboration. I think if you put it together, I've collaborated with more people on more works than almost anybody. But this was like collaborating with Poe himself. It was a special experience. It wasn't just collaborating with the genius of Stuart Gordon and the genius of Jeffrey Combs. It was collaborating. And Jeff will tell you this too. It's like being with Poe when he plays Poe. It's like Poe's your, it's like Poe's your friend. Poe's your, Poe's somebody you've sat and drank with. Poe's somebody you've carried home because he's drunk. Poe's somebody you've sat with as he, as you see the spark in his eye when he's writing a poetic line. It's magic. And it was I hate to use the term magic, but it was, or spiritual, but it was a magic spiritual experience. And working on that play.
And for me as an audience member, that is what the theater is about. That moment when the performer, the play, the actor, and the audience clash and meet. I fell in love with it, absolutely. And, there's so many thoughts and feelings. I just fell in love with the piece. I had been talking to Stuart for months before I produced it in Baltimore. Nevermore, An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe, premieres in Los Angeles at Poe's 200th bicentennial. And that's when I started, Stuart, Team Nevermore, basically, they wanted to take it around, obviously in Baltimore, where I'm based. That's where Poe's family settled, and that's where he's buried, even though he was.
That's where he's buried. Yeah, boy, it was a pilgrimage.
I had been talking to Stuart for a few months because obviously he and I, when we started trying to lay the groundwork to make it happen, wanted it to happen in 2009 during Poe's bicentennial, and things didn't happen. The theater's space. I was even looking at alternate spaces than Westminster Hall, which is basically rented for weddings, where Poe is buried in Baltimore. And so we were lucky to be able to do it for, in 2010, the following year, around January, around Poe's birthday. And
around his birthday, that's right.
What I loved about meeting you and Stuart, when you, three of you, and Jeff, of course, who's the show, came to Baltimore, was a spirit that I so love. It's a kindred spirit, because I was quite shocked. I mean, the city of Baltimore didn't have a lot of money. the space, Westminster Hall, basically a hall for rent that was a church. So it's cavernous and it's echoey. It's not conducive to theater performance. But so I wish we had a little bit more money and a few more people to help. But you and Stuart jumped in like we were all 20 years old doing theater again.
No,
Stuart ran the lights or the sound. You ran the light.
No, Stuart ran the sound. Well, there's only one major light cue. There's two major light cues.
Right.
And if you remember correctly, I was late. If you remember correctly, I was late with one of them. So it's not, this isn't a, come on, kids, let's make a theater, show. This is oh, God, we have to put Dennis back there. Okay, well, let's see what we can do. But it, happily didn't. It's such a good piece, and Jeff is so good at it, and Stuart was so fine a director and so good on the. Oh no, Stuart was there for most of the performances. There was, Stuart is the kind of director who doesn't just direct and then leave. He comes in and he gives you notes all the time. The show can always be better. The show can always be be more effective. The show can you missed a laugh there. What if we did this? What if we just took a little pause there? I mean, and we wouldn't have missed performing in Baltimore for the world. I mean, it was just a train ride for me. But those guys had to fly out, and as I said, for them especially, but for me as well, it was a pilgrimage. I had never been to Poe's grave. I had never been to, I knew Baltimore very little, but it was important to Poe. I live on Edgar Allan Poe Street in New York. New York has several named streets, and 84th Street on the west side, from West End Avenue to Riverside Drive, is Edgar Allan Poe Street. And I live on West End Avenue at 84th Street, because there was a farm here on this property back in the 1840s where Poe rented an outbuilding where he lived for 9 months, where he and Virginia and her mother, lived for 9 months. In those 9 months, he wrote The Raven. So I live within listening distance of Poe reading The Raven to Virginia. So I thought, I'm at one pilgrimage site already, but going to Baltimore was one I was missing. It was, we are forever grateful. And we're, as a group, we've lost Stuart, but we were as a triumvirate, as Team Nevermore, as you call us. We were always and will eternally be grateful to you for bringing us there and giving us that opportunity.
Well, I've loved the Nevermore. An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe has had a life of its own for over a decade, and gosh, Jeff has performed it in less than ideal convention ballrooms
in Las Vegas, in
Las Vegas, and the one Star Trek cruise.
Yeah,
and then I was again
in a venue in Montreal, where people were eating. There were tables where people were drinking. I mean, it was, but it was
theater.
It was very funny, and Stuart was very proud of this. It was at one of the most important horror and fantasy film festivals in North America, is in Montreal, and we were asked to perform Nevermore there, and Jeff did it, and it was for an audience of film freaks, of horror film fans. Few of them go to the theater. Not many of them go to the theater. It stunned them live. It turned that whole a whole new audience on to live theater, and we were so proud of that, especially Stuart. Stuart was incredibly proud of that.
You did a what do you call it? A video panel, kind of an anniversary of that, I think, which was wonderful. I remember watching and listening to that.
Yeah, it was a memorial to Stuart as well. But
specifically, I remember. Yeah. Well, my next involvement that I'm very, very proud of was in Poe's birthplace, the production that was done Halloween night in Boston.
That's what was so special about that one. It was Halloween. It was
Halloween night.
You've been there, and you've been responsible for a couple of the most spectacular performances in great, the venues were strange. This was a movie theater, where Poe films were being shown, on Halloween night. But it was, the venues were strange, but all the better for it. And doesn't the play hold up even the play was built for where it was performed originally in LA, which is a very small and intimate theater space. And if you can be in an intimate theater,
Steve Allen
Steve Allen Theater, which doesn't exist anymore. I believe they recently gutted it. But it was for a couple of hundred people. It was a 199 seat house. And a dedicated theatrical house. Okay, if you ever get a chance to see it, if Jeff does it, if Jeff is doing it in a house like that near you, go see it. But the piece holds up in, as you said, a wedding hall. It holds up in a movie theater. He did it in a movie theater in Tarrytown for the Sleepy Hollow fantasy film festival.
And you're talking about a contemporary box movie theater, not an old auditorium, it was an in between space. It was an in between. Oh, you mean in Boston? No, Boston is an old vaudeville house. Boston
was an old theater. It was an old theater. The thing is, they're huge, and
it works everywhere.
They're huge, and you filled them. You filled those spaces. So there's 1,000 people there. And it's and Jeff is performing as Poe might have. So he's got to project differently and remain Poe. He has to be emote slightly differently and still be intimate. You're absolutely right. It's a one-person show. Jeff is a genius. Yes, and he succeeds. Didn't he succeed? Extraordinarily well?
And this is, if I may, for a moment, the proudest thing I am to contribute to this work is that for the moment, for the time being, there is at least the audio document, audio record of the show.
From Redfield Arts Audio, available now worldwide on Audible. Jeffrey Combs, Nevermore, An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe. Written by Dennis Paoli. Directed by Stuart Gordon. Recorded before a live audience.
You are here this evening, no doubt, to hear yours truly recite the most popular poem ever written upon these shores. For many years, my stories, my tales, that more popular than my poetry. Magazines and readership just demanded, new tale, every issue. Okay, do you hear it? Louder, 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 louder! Villains, I shrieked. Dissemble no more, I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, it is the beating of his
hideous heart.
Which I think is
an extraordinary
is
one.
that Boston. It is that Boston performance, and it is a great performance. In hindsight, as marvelous as that was for me personally, the only little thing I regret, but yet at the same time, I'm glad we didn't have to. At no point, Stuart could not be there. Stuart was doing the Re-Animator, the musical.
Yeah,
and I think he was tied up and couldn't be a part of the Boston performance at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I'm the hybrid stage manager.
Yes,
Jeff,
you were
protector and associate producer, just making it all work for that Halloween performance. And
it worked. It worked great, and the spirit in the audience was so good. I mean, they came in costume, a number of them. You know, the night was this special night when everybody who was there was so ready for it. The welcome he received was so warm, and weren't they? They were, and you know, let's give them credit. They got the jokes. Now, of course, a number of the jokes are aimed at Bostonians.
Yeah.
So they were there for it.
But they got all. You're absolutely right. That audience was, because I had some time to, you know, from the time they were able to open the house to me calling places for Jeff, and we started on time. Mm-hmm. And I think I did the opening rap. That is the only direction I got from Stuart. You need to tell the audience to turn off their cell phones. Set them in the mindset that they are now in late 1840s. I remember distinctly the direction. Mm-hmm. Just turn them off now. And but that audience was this mix of movie fans, Jeff fans, Poe fans, Halloween fans, theater fans. It was like 800 people, the best audience the play could have.
You know, we always get a few academics too, because they want to see Poe. You know, they want the experience. Fictional though it is, they want the experience of seeing Poe deliver his art. You know, read his works, and the mix. It's remarkable how it becomes one audience. It becomes one rapt audience. Focused on this one figure on stage. He focused. Their attention is so sharp. You can almost hear it in the. The fact that you don't hear it is what you're hearing in the recording, in the audiobook of the performance. It is. It's palpable.
Well, that's the difference between.
It was remarkable.
Well, that's the difference between the mediums. The audiobook version is got its strengths, but it is not what makes live theater. And with pandemic today, all theaters trying to survive, they're doing virtual things. I mean, they're basically doing forms of television and film. But when Jeff can do the play again, I urge people wherever it is happening in the world that they've got to see it. It is marvelous. Which leads me, this is a perfect segue. We do hope, obviously, with pandemic, with COVID-19, that there are lots of, I want to see Jeff tour this play and do it for as long as he would like to do it. There has been talk, and there's been of two possible directions to go into. One, like the audiobook version, that there is just a good professional video document of the show done over a couple of performances in a really good theater to document it. That would be marvelous. But somewhere along the line of the life of Nevermore, you wrote a screenplay. Wasn't there an idea to do to adapt it into a film,
an actual feature film? Yeah, that screenplay exists. It has it's a good piece of work, and I'm very proud of it. And it would be if The Black Cat was a successful presentation of Poe, a dramatic presentation of Poe in film, in film form, this would be as well. This would be the next step in that creative journey. Indeed, the script is there. It's just, it's hard to get films made, and it's and some of the issues that existed for The Black Cat, in terms of budget, etc., it would exist for a screenplay of Nevermore, since it takes place in 1840. So it's a costume drama. And if we were going to film it, you have to film it as if it really took place, and therefore you need an audience. So you have a number of more. You have a larger quote unquote cast, even though they have no lines. You have a larger cast. And
I don't know
if you are going to dramatize the reading of the short story, The Telltale Heart, you have to dramatize The Telltale Heart, which means you have a couple more characters as well, even though they don't have any lines. It's kind of a tricky film to pull off, but we think the script works really well. And then, of course, there was the pandemic, so nobody's producing now. But once the pandemic's over, that script will revive itself, and we hope that. We hope that the film gets greenlit, produced, and that everybody has a chance to see it. But even if that just one point more about a film version. Even if a film version happens, or as you said, a really a 3-camera 2-performance document of the theatrical event is created and appears on PBS or something, or Netflix. The fact is, if Jeff is doing what you said before, still is true. If Jeff is doing the show in your town, run to get a ticket. Go see it. There's nothing like sitting in the audience with Jeff, with Poe. And it's nothing like sitting in the audience and spending an hour and a half with Edgar Allan Poe on stage.
I couldn't agree more. I don't know if I ever told you this, but Stuart and I, during one of the periods of hunting for financing for the film of Nevermore, talked about, he picked my brain about where two aspects of it: where to shoot exteriors on the East Coast, and you're in the Mid-Atlantic. You're in the epicenter of Civil War reenactors, which means that by and large, for certain moments, scenes, you've got reenactors in period clothing to hire as extras for people approaching the lecture hall, this, that, and the other. And we talked about that a couple of times on a couple of thrusts to try to find financing for it. And that was, very, very exciting. And in the meantime, as soon as, and I will nudge him, and I don't think he's going to need much nudging, but, when he can, I really will be encouraging Jeffrey and do everything I can to see, Nevermore on stage happen again in the future, because it is
just don't give me the light cue. Just don't make me the lighting. If you, I shouldn't be doing tech for the show. I'll be glad to. I'll be glad to come and watch. I love to come and watch. I'll talk afterwards if you want a Q&A, but no tech.
Oh, then a seat is guaranteed and Q&As. That's the deal. Well, marvelous. Thank you so much for talking about.
It's been a pleasure.
Nevermore.
Pleasure. I love talking about these experiences because I love reliving them. And thank you, not just for the chance to chat, but for the creating those opportunities to perform in two of the most important places in Poe's life, and therefore in the creative life of a show that was very important to Jeff and Stu and I in Baltimore and in Boston, and it was truly extraordinary getting to work with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, Dennis, thank you. No, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and a warm, big thank you to Dennis Paoli for the work that he and I have done the end of last year to be able to release Nevermore and Evening with Edgar Allan Poe on Audible and other platforms. And if you haven't heard it yet, it is such a marvelous, marvelous performance and production that I hope that you take advantage of its availability and give it a listen. Thank you, Dennis, for joining me on the podcast, and thank you for listening. And I hope that you continue to stay with us. We'll have Dennis back. There's so much more to talk about playwriting and screenwriting, and I hope you've been enjoying listening to our eclectic mix of interviews, audio drama, essays, and just our strange audio predilections, all coming from Redfield Arts Audio. Take care of yourselves. Until next time.